All right, good morning, Catholic YouTube. Hello, Papists, one and all. Brian of City the Immaculata, back with you. I'm so used to the little introduction videos that I do that it's like super awkward now to just like hop on, but StreamYard has changed it. Of course, the dog has decided to drink his water right now. I don't know if you guys hear that, but it's like really loud in these headphones. I'll sit here with this new microphone that I got, and I'll put these headphones on, and I don't hear anything. And then I put the headphones on, I've got the windows open, and I'm hearing people talking outdoors. So it's a very sensitive headphone, but it doesn't actually seem to transfer over to what you guys hear, which is nice. The family has gone to the lake with the cousins and aunts and uncles, and I get to stay home with the dog, but c'est la vie, such is life. We're doing okay. I don't particularly like it. I know it's not like popular right now. It seems like the Zoomers have come full circle. We're back to the boomer, you're supposed to hate your wife, but I actually like my wife. I enjoy being in her company, and I miss her when she's gone. So yeah, maybe I'm just like, I'm wholesome in that sense, but I don't have any problem with my wife. In fact, I would say life is easier and better when she's around. So I haven't fallen apart at the seams yet, but give it 2 or 3 days, and it's usually she tells me, she's like, don't eat junk food while I'm gone, and don't really eat junk food, but I don't eat the best, and then I watch the kind of movies that I can't watch when the family. You can only dropped out. And the internet's been weird here too. So I was saying you can only watch Die Hard so many times. I can only watch the old Clint Eastwood Western so many times before it starts to lose its appeal. But be that as it may, today's topic, I've been looking forward to this one for a really long time. This is the reason I do this. This is the reason I love doing this. It gives me the chance to talk about these amazing people. I want to tell you guys about all of these people, about all of these amazing people, all the time, every day of the year. There's not enough hours in the day, not enough years in a life to be able to tell you about all of the amazing people in our church. But to set this kind of wild story up, I want you to follow me on a little adventure. Imagine for a moment that you are a Spanish Franciscan, a Francisco. Your name is Father Alonso de Benavides. It's the 1620s in the decade of our Lord, and you're acting as something akin to the governor of a newly acquired territory. Today we refer to it as the state of New Mexico. At the time it was a territory. The Spanish had recently entered the territory. There is tribes that live in these areas, and among those tribes, the ones that you oversee is one called the Humano tribe. And there's nothing particularly exceptional about this tribe. Nothing really makes them stand out. They're not a martial people. In fact, they're actually quite passive and docile, and they've been terrorized for the last several decades by the Apaches, who had recently acquired various forms of Iberian military technology, such as the horse and certain metal weapons. And the Apache had taken to bullying their neighbors, including this tribe. But this tribe, this Humano tribe, does something that you as a Franciscan in all of your missionary work have never seen before. They anticipate that you would be coming, and they immediately begin requesting a mission. They may see it as a defensive tactic on the part of the Humano, because where the Portuguese or the Spanish set up missions, they will often, more often than not, set up forts, military forts, which comes with its own protections. But regardless, Father Alonso, maybe suspecting this, he asks outright, why do you guys keep asking for a mission? And what they say shocks him and shocks his brothers. The Umanos say that they had been receiving visits from a woman, a lady in blue, they call her, who had informed them that the brothers would be coming, and that once they had arrived, this lady in blue said that they should seek the brothers out. Now, keep in mind in the context, especially with the last lecture that we did, maybe the last several lectures at this point, but particularly the last lecture, right? We are in the age of the Inquisition. We're in the age of the humanists. We're in the age of an increasing skepticism towards supernatural claims. This is not, we're dealing with the Spanish here, right? And while the Spanish were, they have their own really strong history of mysticism, even in the Baroque and modern periods, that mysticism was not always met with open arms by the Spanish themselves, including the government, including the religious orders, including the universities. These people tended to be, especially including the Inquisition, they tended to be skeptical of such claims. Now, of course, some think this may be a ruse. It may be some kind of social hysteria. Some think that it may be Our Lady, those given to a little bit more of the supernatural bent, visiting as she had done not too many decades before to the Mexicans in Guadalupe. But all of this is kind of quickly ruled out as the brothers inquire deeper into who exactly this supposed lady in blue may be. They come to realize that the lady in blue is sounding more and more like a religious. But how is that possible, the brothers ask? They had themselves, the first Christians, had only just arrived. And even if there had been some like previous mission, it's not like the Spanish just let rogue sisters go out and visit the native tribes solo. That would have been unheard of. So fast forward to the year 1629. Father Alonso is back in Spain and he hears of this mystic, this little lady who happens to wear a habit of blue, who had been a confidant of the king. And he comes to believe that it is her who had been visiting the Humano. And so who is this lady? She is, of course, the subject of our lecture today, the Venerable Mother Mary of Jesus of Agreda. Born in 1602 in Agreda, she's born into a incredibly devout, pious family who had connections, excuse me, with the local group of Franciscans. At the behest of the family's spiritual advisor, they turned their home effectively into a monastery. This is a family, husband, wife. The husband might have been deceased at this point, but anyways, family, brothers, sisters that turned their home into a monastery, right? The brothers become religious, the sisters become religious, the mother becomes religious. But you have to remember where we're at and when we're at. This is the context of Spain in the 17th century. That would take up a whole lecture in and of itself. But Spain had, since the era of the great Queen Isabella, been subject to a religious awareness, a sort of religious revival that could border on what modern people may consider a sort of fanaticism. They had only just removed the infidel Muslims who had, for centuries, for time immemorial, as far as these people are concerned, occupied their lands. And then, about 20 years after, comes Martin Luther. Protestant Reformation hits. It doesn't come to Spain, but there's a pretty intense reaction in Spain to the events taking place on the continent, including a ramping up of the Inquisition, which tried to sniff out error and heresy under basically any and every rock. Into the ire of these Inquisition men fell some who would eventually turn out to be saints. You have Saints Francis of Borgia. You have, of course, Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross. These mystics were, at one time, they weren't necessarily condemned, but they were suppressed. They were persecuted, all by their fellow churchmen. Now, so Mary, our subject today, she comes up in the generation immediately following a spiritual rehabilitation, a reform, and the true sense of the word of the Carmelites. This reform, as of course many of you are aware, called the Discalced Carmelites, because they would take their shoes off, and this was a mark of their poverty and their reforming, visual mark of that. Though her path would be markedly more within the context of Franciscan theology, she's within that same vein of a reforming monastic mindset that had set off with Teresa of Avila and the Carmelites and St. John of the Cross, the sort of flowering of reform-minded individuals. So she becomes a conceptionist, a concepcionista, which is the Franciscan Sisters of the Immaculate Conception. And this is an interesting choice, and it will have an effect on how her story plays out. This order was founded by Saint Beatrice of Silva, a Portuguese woman, a 15th century reforming religious. She predates a lot of these later reformers like Teresa of Avila, but within sort of the same context idea. The big difference, though, is that the Protestant Reformation happens in the intervening period. So it's hard to say like 15th century reformers are the same as 17th century, but it's within the same kind of idea. St. Beatrice is friends with Queen Isabella, who encouraged her to form this order with the dedication to Our Lady, as it was then still debated and hotly contested. The emphasis of the order would be on the Immaculate Conception. Now, similar to some of the issues faced by Teresa in her pursuit to start a Discalced monastery, Mary's efforts were stymied, at times simply due to a lack of available reforming religious sisters who could come set up a Discalced house in Agreda. I remember I've read, was it last summer, maybe the summer before last, really good biography. I didn't know much about Teresa of Avila. And I remember when she was trying to start her reform movement, that was one of the problems that she had, was you had to, like, it's one thing for you to reform, but if you want to start a reforming movement, she had to bring the sisters in. So the church, Teresa, even when she was being persecuted, she always had her supporters, and they kind of worked diligently to get her sisters that were within the right, because you wouldn't just force a sister to come and join this like very strict religious movement. So there was always these challenges to try to find the right people, and eventually you hope it's kind of like a snowball effect where it sort of takes on a life of its own. But in 1627, she is elected abbess of the house, which she remained the superior of until her death in 1665. She is, of course, most known for this work, The Mystical City of God. Now, this is the abridged version, translated by Fiskar Marison, the Reverend George J. Blatter. It's a popular abridgment. The full set is actually full 4 volumes. Tan, who puts this abridged version out, does publish the full set. Nice hardback series. I will probably put out the expense for that eventually, but for now, I just read the popular version. And this work is honestly nothing short of a masterpiece of theological insight and wisdom, as far as I'm concerned. One has to wonder at times where the depth of these religious come from. She almost, it seems, without effort, she lays out basically scotistic metaphysics and theology in ways that are like the clarity. I've tried to write some theology before, and to get a precision of language that also has a clarity to it, it is not easy. Trust me, folks. It is quite difficult to write theology and to write it well and to write it in a way that's clear and understandable. I do think that people often struggle with the subtlety of Blessed John Duns Scotus's metaphysics and his theology. And that's often because, well, one, we're just not as smart. People today just aren't as smart as people in the Middle Ages were, because they were kind of forced. We've got so many things that we rely on for crutches, where back then they had to, like, in order to receive a good education, they had to force themselves for memorization and the ability for them to like hold a train of thought. For, I mean, with Blessed John Duns Scotus, he'll take something for like 20-30 pages, and you're like sitting there reading him and you're like, okay, wait, are we still for this or are we against this now? I kind of forget, like, so following these guys can be tricky sometimes for many of us. What this work is essentially a, well, first, I mean, what it is in its first place is it's a prayerful meditation on Our Lady and her place in the divine councils, next to her Son in the economy of salvation, both in his life, the role that she plays in his life as co-redemptrix, and in his church, the role she plays in his church as mother and teacher and mediatrix of all graces. Venerable Mary gives us all of it, really. She even has in the very early pages the whole setup of the scotistic absolute primacy of Jesus and Mary. In the metaphysical realm, she kind of lays it all out. She's not saying that's what I'm doing, but if you're aware and you're reading this, then you can't help but see it. What I mean, and so I've talked about this in some of my lectures in my Franciscan series, but the absolute primacy of Jesus and Mary is an essential, it's a core feature of the unique Franciscan doctrines. So it really, you're just beginning with Jesus and Mary first in the intentions of the great divine plan to create. Then God creates the angels, then he creates the cosmos, then man, and from the after of all of that is the sins, right? So the incarnation, absolute primacy of Christ, and the means by which that would be brought about, as far as the absolute primacy of Christ and Mary are concerned, the incarnation and the means by which that would be brought about are the very first things in the divine councils in the plan of creation. Then, of course, she boldly asserts the Immaculate Conception, especially as it pertains to the scotistic absolute primacy of Christ and Mary. So really, it's just a rich theological meditation on the Franciscan thesis, presented in a really kind of powerful Baroque format. And that's actually where the trouble begins. And I'm still researching this. I really only came to Mary about a year ago. Her name kind of pops up. I'd heard about her in relation to the Humanos. You hear about that story, but I hadn't really spent much time with her. And something finally clicked about a year ago. And I was like, let me spend some time with this, because somebody I was reading said something, and I was like, yeah, I need to like pay attention to that. So I'm still researching it. I may eventually come to some different conclusions. I'm going to present what I think are sort of the options of what's happened. I'm veering in the direction of the problems being, as one could imagine, these things often are more complex than I originally assumed, and then more complex than some authors assume. But regardless, I have no doubt that at least some, if not all, at least some of her problems stem from the fact that she is promoting a Scotistic Franciscan view of theology. There's just no denying that. And there's always been attempts by powerful, learned men, usually Dominicans, but not always, who sought to quell wherever and whenever Scotism starts rearing its head, especially when it becomes popular. And this, no doubt whatsoever, this is a hugely, hugely popular work. It's been translated multiple times. It's never been out of print. As far as the laity were concerned, this for Catholics for many years is like a must-have on your bookshelf. The Mystical City of God was a bestseller. So of course it was going to attract skeptical eyes to it. If you get something that's just that popular, that is promoting SCOTUS, you will see people get very defensive. And it's a super fascinating thing because there's things about SCOTUS that once the ideas get out there and they like permeate into the consciousness of people, the church tends to kind of get on board because the laity get on board because some of these things just make sense. I was not necessarily struggling with aspects of the Christian narrative, but when SCOTUS makes a shift like the absolute primacy of Christ, it's a subtle shift, no doubt, but the downstream effects of something like the absolute primacy of Christ in many ways affects everything else. Everything else flows from SCOTUS on the absolute primacy of Christ. If he's right on that, then there's huge implications for that in all of our theology. Most of the people who are going to bring up the mystical city of God and the controversy around it, most of the time you see this, they home in on the condemnations that came from Paris. But even before that controversy, Rome actually weighed in 1681 with an apparent placement of the mystical city of God on the index. Though this was met with an immediate protest. I don't know, like there's the claim that it was placed there by either a typo, like a mystical city of God typo, on the index, or there was a publisher, whoever the publisher was, kind of had a nefarious intent and put it on the index, even though it shouldn't have been there. Though I have also heard that in Rome there were voices not thrilled with the Scotistic language that Mary was presenting in this work. Be that as it may, a faulty translation of the text made its way to the Sorbonne in Paris in 1696, and really from there it was sort of a all hell breaks loose kind of situation. 132 doctors at the Sorbonne decreed. They met together, they discussed the work, and they decreed that, quote, it gave more weight to the revelations alleged to have been received than to the mystery of the Incarnation, that it adduced new revelations which the apostles themselves could not have supported, that it applied the term adoration to Mary, that it referred all her graces to the Immaculate Conception, that it attributed her role to the government of the Church, that it designated her in every respect the Mother of God and the mediatrix of grace. It pretended that St. Anne had not contracted sin in her birth, and besides a number of other imaginary and scandalous assertions. Bishop Jacques Beignet-Bosset declared that the work was, quote, an impious impertinence and a trick of the devil. He objected to its title, to its apocryphal stories, to its what he called its indecent language, and of course, its exaggerated Scotistic philosophy. So what you have happening here is these, and yes, this is an undisputed fact of this, you have this group, largely a group of Dominicans, it's just a fact of history, who are absolutely bent on keeping this popular work of Scotistic religiosity from spreading as it presented the Scotistic formulation of things in a manner of a sort of mystical outpouring of this ecstatic writing. a double whammy to the consternation for many of these these clergy, right? It's both scotistic and it's mystical. And again, you've got to keep the context of the time in mind. There's still, though, by the time of Mary, the debates around the Immaculate Conception were starting to change. You have, especially in Spain, the Salamancenses, the school of the Spanish school in Spain, these Carmelites who really start to turn the dial, where the Dominicans become a little bit more accepting of this strongly defended scotistic belief. It was already appearing the cause for which the cause for which Thomas's, I won't say Thomas's supporters had championed so hard for in the aftermath of Scotus writing about the Immaculate Conception. For decades, they had seen that cause really kind of falling apart and falling away for them. The Immaculate Conception was becoming, as I'm saying, like as these scotistic ideas get out there, the laity was kind of behind it from the beginning. It was the learned men who had to be sort of caught up. And so the Immaculate Conception is at first sort of taken as a defeat. And in many ways, though, I've heard quite a few people online defend whether or not they defend the fact that Thomas, in their view, St. Thomas does not deny the Immaculate Conception. I'm not an expert on that. I don't really read Thomas that deeply, but be that as it may, the later interpreters of Thomas, including Torquemada and Cajetan, did not believe that Thomas held to the Immaculate Conception, and they fought vehemently in the name of Thomas against what they saw as this great error of the Scotists. And so that debate is still there's still a place for it. It's still happening at this moment. So here you have Mary of Agreda writing this work that defends not just the absolute primacy of Christ, which of course is clearly Scotistic, but also the Immaculate Conception, and she's defending it from a clearly Scotistic framework, denying the Thomists even the ability to contextualize the doctrine in a way that may be more palpable to those Thomists who originally had vehemently denied the common doctor ever taught it to begin with. Here they're trying to find a way to unimmaculatize the conception as they possibly can. And Mary, Blessed Mary here, throws in this wrench into the gears for them because, again, it was a very popular work, which is a source of another complaint about her, that this writing was, and you'll still hear people complain about this, and this is probably more a personal preference for people, but one of the things you'll hear about the complaints of her is that her rhetorical style was too flowery, too baroque, too full of this kind of Marian piety that the new humanist church was trying to rid itself of. But says Mary, she says we're going to write of Our Lady in the most elegant and embellished language that Spanish can muster, which is quite a bit, right? If you know anything about the Romance languages, if you know anything about Spanish, it can be quite flowery. And look, even the critics of Mary of Agreda will acknowledge that her Spanish prose is beautiful, even if they say it's too flowery. Many of them acknowledge the work as a masterpiece of language. Of course, that didn't stop the detractors from using what was actually a strength and a sign of her devotion to the Blessed Mother as a weapon against her. You know, I think the snares of the devil will use whatever means that he can to keep the saints and the truth from seeing the light of day. Now, later investigations routinely came back much more favorable toward the mystical city of God. Immediately, there was complaints about the translation, the Sorbonne condemnations were reliant on a faulty translation. Benedict XIV later had the work investigated, and even as late as he, in the 18th century, he said that there were rumors that are spreading around about this work, that the work had been tampered with. So, you know, these opponents to the work were like, yeah, okay, we're kind of acknowledging now that, Venerable Mary was a holy, pious woman, but you can't trust the book because somebody tampered with the book. That's what we're kind of getting to now by the time of Benedict the 14th. So he says, look, let's do an investigation into the work. Now, to be balanced in my assessment here, it was not, and I repeat, it was not universal that the Dominicans condemned this work. Many Dominicans, in fact, especially those in Spain, saw the work as a beautiful devotional to Our Lady, and they supported Mary. They supported the transmission of this work. And so, well, I think it's probably better, like if you can see in the intro of this work, there is a list. So it's the approbations given to this work and where those come from. Let me see the page here. So this is from two professors, 1715. So around this time that these things are being disputed. And this is what these professors write in the intro to this book. They say, all the faculties except the Jansenistic, keep that in mind, except the Jansenistic members of the Sorbonne at Paris, published highest recommendations. At the same time, the learned men and teachers of each religious order that maintain institutions of learning in Europe were asked to contribute their opinions. The following religious orders complied: the Augustinians, the Benedictines, the Carmelites, the Dominicans, the Jesuits, the Cistercians, the Basilians, the Trinitarians, so on and so forth, all unanimously endorsing the favorable decision previously published by the University of Salamanca. And Salamanca, quite well known for its presentation of Thomism, was quite favorable and was some of the strongest supporters for Mary of Agreda came from the University of Salamanca. So the Salamancenses were all about Venerable Mary of Agreda. Let's see, anything else here? So yeah, that kind of gets to that point. There was a Cardinal Joseph Sánchez de Agreda, and though he agreed that the theologians of Sorbonne were within their right to suppress the work at the university, he said that within Spain's border, he was a cardinal from Spain, he said within Spain's border that no actions would be taken against the work. And this was much to Bishop Bossuet's dislike. Now, let's see, their names were Damon and Parmentier, Herman Damon, Anton Parmentier, these doctors, these professors of theology in this intro note that it was in their assessment a contingent of Jansenists at the Sorbonne. And I think that's possibly a little bit of loaded language. By the 18th century, of course, the Jansenists were under a lot of fire. And so and look, there's clearly, like, the Jansenists were at the Sorbonne and the University of Paris. So it's not unlikely that there was a contingent of them. Now, whether that contingent goes all the way back to the original complaints and attempts to suppress Mary of Agreda, I can't speak to for sure, but it was certainly, in a rhetorical sense, would have been very potent at the time the testimonies were made to point out that, hey, at this very university, you have a huge contingent of Jansenists. And along with their many other errors, they went against Venerable Mary of Agreda's mystical city of God. So I think there's a case to be made for that, right? The Jansenists and the Gallicans were heavily active in Paris at this time, which gets me to another point which I think may be at play. And this, again, to be like balanced in this, it's easy to overstate at times the Dominican-Franciscan rivalry. While I do believe, I mean, if you read the history, there clearly was rivalry, at times more intense among certain individuals than others, at times more collectively intense against the orders themselves against each other. I don't think it was as pronounced in all cases at all times as sometimes we make it out to be. Usually a little theological opinion would, for whatever reason, it would be contest. It was almost like a, I noticed these things on. I'm really only ever on X. I don't really do much other social media, but on X, this is almost like weekly, at the very least monthly on X. Like some new little like hot topic will like pop up, and everybody's debating that, and it's all the rage, and then they're like on to the next thing. That's kind of the same thing, except these were a little bit more like, sometimes they were like centuries long debates back then. People, this is before the days of cable television and social media, so people had more time on their hands to sit with these things. But besides just the rivalry, the intra-Catholic rivalry within the orders, I believe there was also a serious nationalism, and the sort of cleaving reality of European Christendom severing at this point, I think, has a big part to play in it. And even though Spain and the French at least nominally remained Catholic, there was in France the Gallicans, a deeply troubling contingent of schismatics which arose in France in the wake of the Great Papal Schism. There's a lot of errors involved in the Gallicans, which is closely tied up to the errors of the Jansenists. And subsequent, the council that followed the Great Papal Schism, the Council of Constance, created this group of in the church known as the conciliarists, which is a heretical thing to hold to, which the Gallicans held to. And they were rivals of the so-called ultramontanes, those who defended papal prerogatives. And look, as you can guess, Spain in her theological schools, as well as in her political influence, almost always sided with Rome over this group of French conciliarists. Spain was one of the most loyal daughters of the church in all of Europe. They say France is the first daughter, but France is the black sheep daughter of the church. Spain has been historically very, very close and sort of joined at the hip with Rome. Now, all of this would eventually come to a head in the 19th century, these arguments and these debates around the ultramontanists versus the conciliarists, and it would be settled by Vatican I. But in these intervening decades, I could easily see the Sorbonne resistance to Spain's piety as an act of, let's say, national hubris. Now, you may notice I keep referring to her as the Venerable Mary of Agreda, and this is, in my opinion, the truly tragic part of this story. Unfortunately, Mary's cause has been stalled and thwarted at several turns, and it remains so to this very day. It was under Innocent the 11th that the mystical city of God was both suppressed and lifted in 1681. It was under Benedict the 13th that Mary's cause was moved forward in 1729 with much pressure from her adherents. And look, that's another thing too. Through all of these debates that are like raging, I almost said raging online. Through all of these debates that are raging in academia, in the halls of the universities and the schools of theology, at the popular level, Mary had as well-founded a cult of sainthood as just about anybody. So Benedict the 13th is pressed to move forward the cause of her canonization. Later, Benedict the 14th, as we said, had the mystical city of God examined, and it received an approbation by the University of Salamanca in 1749. So we've made advances, don't get me wrong, but the frustration for me is at like every step, and this is similar to the situation with Blessed John Duns Scotus. At every step, as we get closer and closer, there seems to be something that comes up that pushes it further and further out. And I'm not like bitter about these things or anything. It's like she is a venerable, she is recognized, but when it's the politics that cause these things, it's when it becomes a little bit frustrating for me. Scotus should clearly be recognized as a saint and as a doctor of the Catholic Church. His influence has permeated an entire order's tradition, and we still haven't found it, the ability to now there's a little bit of a anarchic sense in which the Scotists transmitted his work, which has helped to prevent his cause getting through. But be that as it may, there has been along the way a lot of people that have sought to stymie and sabotage, if you will, the cause for him. And the same thing for Mary of Agreda. I still, when I would bring her up occasionally, and some of you guys, if this was you that does this, like, no offense to you guys, but I still get, like, when I bring Mary of Agreda up, people that are just, I won't say repulsed, but they're cautious of her, and they whatever the, how do I want to say this, like, whatever that innate distrust of Catholic, especially like coming out of like medieval Catholic piety. It's innate in many people, and many Catholics, many modern Catholics. And part of what I see, and this is part of this wider project that I'm doing here, is presenting these people to you in such a way that you can kind of like navigate like who's who and what is this a part of and what is it separate from. So by going after the humanists, I don't want to like attack humanism qua humanism. As we said last week, there was good things that come out of it. I wouldn't attack the Inquisitions as such. There was good things that came out of the Inquisition, undoubtedly. I certainly wouldn't attack the Counter-Reformation and all of the things that came from the Tridentine reforms. But I do like to like pump the brakes at times, because it's the inherent in our human condition that we tend to overcorrect. And a lot of the arguments that I see against Mary of Agreda are, you could easily see a Protestant making those arguments. And I don't think that we should set out. Now, look, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be conservative voices. Newman acknowledges this in the development of doctrine. You need conservative voices. We don't just want to like steamroll any and all things through. Conservative voices do add as caution. The problem is when those conservative voices are the only voices and they try to suppress the legitimate development of our understanding of something like our Mariology, which brings us to the modern day and recent times. From the period of Vatican II forward, the challenge is, as I see it, that Vatican II has sort of thrown out there, was that the Mariology of Mary of the type like Venerable Mary of Agreda it's antiquarian, it's dated, it's no longer relevant to the new church. Now, if this is something that you're interested in, if this sounds like an interesting subject to you, I would really recommend this work, Venerable Mother Agreda and the Mariology of Vatican II. This is by Father Enrique Lamas, and I think this work does a pretty knockout job. That it's not, he makes the case that it's not possible for Mary of Agreda, how do I want to say this? Okay, so this is in this period, let's say the 1990s, I want to say, I'm not quite for sure, but I think it's in the 1980s or 90s, the CDF does a review once again of Mary of Agreda's Mystical City of God. And they come back with the determination that Mary's Mystical City of God is perfectly orthodox theology. It's fine to read. It's within the scope of orthodox theology. At the same time, there's a group coming after the council, coming out of the council, coming after the council, dare I say a certain spirit of the council, which claims that the Mariology that you would find in Venerable Mary of Agreda is, again, antiquated. It's no longer pertinent to the new type of Catholic Church. And I think, okay, so we're at that point, somebody's either we're holding a contradiction or somebody's wrong. Because the CDF has just said that everything that's within the Mystical City of God is orthodox. It's theologically okay to believe and hold. But if that's the case, then you got these people that are saying that no, Vatican II has basically done away with that. Then either the CDF is wrong or the spirit of Mariology coming out of Vatican II is wrong. And this book makes the case, as you could imagine, that there's nothing in a proper reading, once again, a proper reading of the council, there's nothing that comes out of the conciliar documents on Mary which would be anything at odds with the Mariology that you would find in Mary of Agreda and Mary of Agreda. In fact, they are quite in line with one another. As you can imagine, there's a lot I could say about this. The first thing is, there's this like humanist desire, even in the most like cringe elements of the charismatic movement of the 70s, to deny Our Lady's role. I think it's how would I even express this? It's like a coming out of the humanist movement and then coming out of the Protestant movement. There was this thing that happened where the original reformers were quite humanist in their approach to theology. And there was even a scholastic period of Protestant theology. And so if you kind of take that as like a trajectory, and there's similar concurrent things that are happening within the Catholic Church. But then in Protestantism, you get these break off like pious movements, Lutheran piety, and the Wesleyans, right? And then all the way down into the 20th century with the Charismatics movement. And you would think that these groups are going way off like this, but it's almost like a horseshoe curve. In many ways, they kind of come back around and end up resembling each other in strange ways. Like there is a lot of overlap at times. This would be a whole other conversation, but there's a lot of overlap at times between some of the errors of the charismatic movement versus the errors of the traditionalist movement in the Catholic Church. But you will find that these charismatic groups coming out of the 60s and 70s like to downplay and diminish Our Lady's role in salvation, not just in the economy of salvation, but also in the divine councils, which is a key argument that was taking place at Vatican II. So this group, we'll say Marian skeptics, just making up a term out of thin air, these Marian skeptics who seemingly were very prominent at Vatican II, who by many of those proclaiming victory after the council claimed that they won the day, these people are constantly seeking to downplay Our Lady and the pious devotion that she elicits in the faithful. So of course a book like Mary of Agreda's The Mystical City of God, we're going to have to say, yeah, that's cute that the CDF said all of that, but the reality is that the council has done away with any of that. And I think that again, it's a complex topic, but I think there's many reasons for it. I didn't come into the church through the Protestant route. I came into the church directly. I was a secular who had overtones of religious desire and spiritual interests. And so I didn't have the hang up about certain things that some people that come into the church. And I feel like people bring their hang-ups into the church. And I totally get the idea that we as Catholics, especially those of us that are well-formed, people are coming into the faith. We shouldn't make it difficult for them. We shouldn't scandalize them with like hard beliefs. But I had just posted this actually on X yesterday. I think at times we're so comfortable with like certain things that have just clearly been accepted that we don't even you kind of take it for granted. Like in many ways, I think the idea of the Mother of God, the Theotokos, the Mater Dei, I think that's actually even more radical an idea than the idea of Mary as co-redemptrix, than the idea of Mary as mediatrix, or the Immaculate Conception. And people get like really hung up on those like Marian dogmas, but Mother of God, now of course the Protestants will have a problem with it. They have always sort of struggled with the Nestorian reading of Scripture, but many Catholics, no problem whatsoever. Holy Mary, Mother of God, right? They just toss it out there like there's nothing, but we don't hide that from people. We don't put it under the nightstand, right, and tuck it away towards it's in the shadows, right? Like we boldly declare it every time we pray our public rosaries, right? Holy Mary, Mother of God. And so I think there needs to be some kind of balance between these things where we don't force a high Mariology on people that aren't ready for it, but at the same time, we don't tuck it away and we don't run from it. There's a humanist factor, which I discussed somewhat last time, this sort of disdain for pious devotions of the faithful, especially any of which reek of medievalism, especially those which are Marian. And of course, when you're dealing with the Venerable Mary of Agreda and the mystical city of God, it's deeply steeped in our medieval tradition, and it's deeply steeped in our medieval Marian traditions, and it's deeply steeped in the Franciscan tradition. So it's got all of these things kind of working against it as far as the quote unquote new Vatican II church would say. And I'm not condemning Vatican II church. I think if you want to, like, again, this is a good source if you want to see how the council is not in contradistinction to what you would read in the mystical city of God. The second thing I think too, besides just the sort of humanist disdain, is there's this idea that I'm getting at here where there's almost like a forced ecumenism in the name of appeasing Protestants that was like always seeking in the aftermath of the council to sort of downplay any Mariology that wasn't just the absolute bare minimum of what we have to accept. But even like, again, the bare minimum to me, this is like a tangent. Like, I'm sorry, guys, I'm like running on here, but even the bare minimum of our Mariology is still pretty radical. So I don't accept that, like, oh, well, okay, well, all we got to do is accept the Mother of God. We don't want to push that idea of perpetual virgin. Okay, maybe she remained a virgin she remained chaste the rest of her life, but the actual theological ramifications of perpetual virginity, we're not going to like hone in on that too much. We're, maybe, okay, we got to accept now the Pope Pius the ninth dropped the hammer down on us with the Immaculate Conception. Now we have to accept that, but how can we minimize it? Oh, it was just that Mary was, preserved from all sin. There's no positive theology within any of that. But if you read or if you study the theology of some of our great modern saints like St. Maximilian Kolbe, there's a positive theology behind the Immaculate Conception. And Kolbe is, of course, by these very same people, these very same sort of modern thinkers, dismissed as nothing but a pious journalist. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, what he has to say about Mary and the Immaculate Conception. So these men, with their fingers crossed, kind of hope, they always seem to be hoping that gone are the days when the dreaded Marian devotions of, Louis de Montfort or Alphonsus Liguori, of Maximilian Kolbe, and yes, of Mary of Agreda, that we could just put all, we could, consign all of that to the past. We've done away with all of that. Vatican II has come and it has suppressed our traditional Mariology, and now we can get on with the good old-fashioned Protestant Christology. What this group didn't anticipate, though, and thank God for his infinitely wise providence, that we would get one of the most Marian popes in all of history. Pope John Paul II, he canonizes St. Maximilian Kolbe, somewhat of a controversial move. He calls him the great martyr of charity. He writes Marian encyclicals. He promotes Marian devotion. He promotes Our Lady as co-redemptrix. Dare I say, we might have a little bit of a fan of the Venerable Mary of Agreda and our great Saint Pope. It certainly appears that despite the best efforts from those of the council afterwards to sort of undermine the real intention of Vatican II and what it was expressing in its Mariology, and you guys know they did this in so many other ways too, right? The aftermath of the council has been sort of a nightmare to sort of slog through, the liturgical sense and the ecumenical sense, also in our Mariological sense. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but it's true. And now we've even had a little bit of a setback. This will sometimes come up when these topics come up. Benedict XVI and Pope Francis more recently spoke none too kindly toward the Marian co-redemption specifically. But also, I think the key to that is they didn't really write definitively against it. And when you read the statements from Pope Benedict XVI and you read the statements from Pope Francis, I think the way to read it is, as we're doing theology, they're offering a conservative voice. And we should read the hesitations of the two popes with seriousness. And I'm saying we loosely, theologians should read it with seriousness and take into consideration what they're saying, while also looking at the much more positive. By positive, I mean like the copious amounts of theology that's been written about Our Lady as co-redemptrix from Pope John Paul II. Specifically, read his Redemptoris Mater, but several of his what's the Dolores? I can maybe link it if I think about it later. And now we're in the era, it's an interesting time, we're in the era of Pope Leo XIV, who I believe is going to prove himself to be a Marian Pope as well. And I have hopes for both for the dogma of the co-redemption, if not being dogmatized. I don't necessarily see that in my lifetime, but at least promulgated more at some high level. As well, I have hopes for the future of the cause of Mary of Agreda, which brings me back to the very beginning. When Father Alonso de Benavides comes back to Spain, as we said, he visits with Mother Mary. He's speaking with her and he's questioning her, and it becomes evident to him that it was in fact she and not Our Lady who had visited the Humanov. That's right, folks. Our small, tiny, unassuming Mary of Agreda is now known for her bilocations. Now, of course, this is going to bring with it a fair degree of skepticism. And I just say fair, all right, fair. I admit a healthy dose of skepticism is fine for extraordinary claims, but it also brings the ire of the folk who really just hate this form of Catholicism. Those who would love to make the faith more Protestant, sort of. They kind of want to. I see some of these folks. It's almost as if they see the Catholic Church as Protestantism with the tiara. And if you want that, just go to the Orthodox. I'm sorry, that's not what the Catholic Church is. The Humano people came up to Father Alonso and said, "Bring us missionaries. Bring us the sacraments." How do you know those things? The lady in blue told us. Now, while the Mother Abbess was in her cell, in these moments of intense mystical prayers, which she was well known to engage in, she apparently discorporated and visited a pagan people halfway around the world and spoke to them of the holy men that would soon be coming and how they should request and they should ask for the saving sacraments. I think this revelation as well, that it was in fact her who visited them, having never left her cell in Agreda, stands as a testament for why Mary of Agreda is so despised and so loved. You know, she kind of stands at the precipice of two worlds. The old enchanted world of Catholicism, where saints do miracles on the regular, and the modern world of Protestantism and skepticism and nihilism, and on the other extreme, a sort of radical fideism that accepts any and all claims of mysticism. But I ask you, dear listeners, to give this lady, this venerable Spanish woman, a chance. Take the time to read her. I can't say she is the easiest to sit down on a Sunday afternoon for light reading. It is meditative reading. It is more akin to something like you would if you read, you know, St. Catherine of Siena's dialogues, if you read mystical writings, right? If you're used to mystical writings, you're used to this type of writing. But if you're not, it could be a little bit of a chore for you guys to get through. But I have gained a lot out of it. I think it expresses Franciscan theology in a way that if you're just going to sit down with an academic work of Franciscan theology, you may not walk away with anything necessarily pertinent to your spiritual life, whereas Venerable Mary of Agreda is going to be able to present it to you in such a way that I think it is fruitful and spiritually edifying, and hopefully brings you closer to our mother and, of course, to her son. Flavia, my friend, I'm currently reading The Mystical City of God, and it's a shame that she hasn't been canonized. Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting closer, you know. I think we're coming up to a moment where the Franciscan tradition is going to come into its own. That's my hope, anyways. I see more interest in it recently. I think what it is, and I guess I would have to like really gather my thoughts on this, but when St. John Henry Newman converted to the Catholic Church, when he came into the Catholic Church in the mid to late 19th century, the theological schools of the Catholic Church were in an abysmal state. He was actually kind of scandalized when he went to Rome at the abysmal state of Catholicism. And we had been through the French Revolution. There was the revolutions of 1848. There was all of these revolutions of unification that are taking place across the continent. Like, our theology was just in a really rough place. And then what happens is you get Pope Leo the 13th, who begins this revival of Thomism. And what that kind of turned into was, in the same way that there was a spirit of Vatican II that was, I think, a little bit contra to the intention of those who wanted to revive the schools of the Catholic Church after the wake of all the revolutions. It turned into a small group of Dominicans specifically, who saw that as an opportunity to basically make St. Thomas in their own readings the arbitrator of the faith. And that was never, I don't believe that was the intention of Pope Leo the 13th. I don't believe it was really the intention of Pope Pius X. I think in the realm of speculative theology, St. Thomas Aquinas clearly holds a place of prominence and importance. In the seminaries, if we're trying to train priests to go out into the world and face the world, I say there's probably no one better than St. Thomas for them to be trained in. But it wasn't a carte blanche. We are now in the Catholic Church of St. Thomas Aquinas, right? That was never the intentions of these things. So in the wake of Vatican II, one of the things that the council called for was a fontes where the orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Jesuits, all of these orders, the Carmelites, they go back to their own sources and they revisit and revitalize their own sources of theology. And that's been kind of a slow process. These things take a long time, but I do think we're starting to see fruit from that. You know, at one time there was no critical edition of the work of Blessed John Duns Scotus, and that's held him up. I think this too is kind of interesting. Catholics are they're like hungry for something. They know that the way that this manualist, sort of dry way that the neo-scholastics wanted to present Thomas, and I know I'm making a little bit of a what's the word here? Like, I'm not trying to make a caricature of the manualists or the neo-Thomists. There's things in them that are probably good, but the church is much more dynamic than just that. It's much more dynamic than just the manualists. And you see a flood of interest into the Eastern tradition, right? There's some that are unfortunately going all the way into schism, but quite a few. I've known some people in my life who have made the jump over to the Eastern Catholic Church. I mean, personally, I don't think that you're going to find all of the answers there. I think that's a little bit of wishful thinking to think that that's going to be the solution to the problems. I think the true thing is to have robust schools in the Catholic Church, be they Franciscan, be they Dominican, be they Jesuit, be they Carmelite, be they even, with emphasis on the Eastern Catholic tradition, and they're all engaging each other in ways that are challenging and not like the Dominicans, yeah, like bring it on. Like, don't come and try to like have us condemned as heretics, which was what some of the Franciscans and Dominicans and Jesuits all did to each other at one time. Like, let's kind of get past that, but let's also be able to like show up to dispute. Like, I don't care to see Catholics debate Jay Dyer or some atheist or whoever, right? Like, I want to see the schools. I think we'd be much more fruitful if we had Dominicans and Franciscans debating each other and having these sort of like respectful but challenging debates within one another. But going all the way back to your question here, or to your comment here, I think there's a change that's happening right now where people are. I've had quite a few people reach out to me, more than I ever thought. You look at my channel, guys, I'm never mentioned among the big channels. When people are sharing channels, they typically don't share mine, but it's a niche interest. It's been palpable for me. I have actually gone to mass, and granted, in the summertime there's a lot of tourists over at our main parish, but I've had somebody, like an actual Franciscan, walk up to me, and he knew who I was. He knew what my channel was. He knew the work that I was doing. And I've had people reaching out to me. I actually had a Russian Orthodox reach out to me just the other day, who said that he was interested in the Catholic Church and he'd been gaining a lot from. He's Russian Orthodox, born in Russia, cradle Orthodox, and I was really touched by his message to me and like the fact that something that I said was speaking to him. So I think there's an interest in these things that are growing. I'm only like one small channel. I don't have a wide reach, but this is how these things start. I think people are hungry for something. I know that William Albright, he's got a larger channel. As far as I can tell, he seems to be fairly Scotistic at times in his approach to his Mariology, and you even hear like some of the classic names out there, like Bishop Robert Barron, becoming more friendly towards the Franciscan tradition, and maybe that'll help to get us some of these people too. Would you compare and contrast Venerable Mary's Mariology to Blessed Anne's? That's Anne Catherine Emmerich, I guess you're talking there. St. Bridget's and Mary Valtorta's. You know, I'm actually not as I've had the Dolores Passion of the Christ on my shelf for years, and I've unfortunately never read it. And it was one of those books, like, I bought it because, who was it? Mel Gibson, his Passion of the Christ was a watershed for a lot of us. I was just a young man when that movie came out, and I went to go see it. I was not Christian, and I was like, yeah, just bowled over by seeing that movie. And then, of course, I read that it was this woman. I wasn't really even interested in the Catholic Church at the time and her mystical visions. I would have to spend some more time with those to be able to give you any kind of like concise. Generally speaking, though, if there's a lay pious devotions, especially the Marian devotions, they tend to be pretty high in their Mariology. I can't think of any off the top of my head, and if you guys know any, maybe mention them in the comments. Are there any Marian devotions that have been accepted by the Church that would qualify as Marian minimalists, or just low in their Marian devotions? I mean, Blessed John Duns Scotus said that where we can, we should seek to maximize what we say about Our Lady, and I think our devotions over the centuries have sort of our private revelations have kind of played out towards that end. I would say that probably in a comparison, I believe, if I remember right, let me look. Let me see here. Okay, so she was an Augustinian canonist. I'm just not as familiar with them and what their positions would be. I can't imagine that they would be as Scotistic in her metaphysical approach, if she even has a metaphysical approach in her Dolores Passions. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't have an answer for you as far as that goes. But in St. Bridget of Sweden, I think she is coming out of the Venerable Mary of Agreda is coming out of the medieval tradition, which I think is it develops over time, and it becomes more, the precision and clarity in our language about our mother becomes more precise, but she's clearly within line. I think within, and maybe emphasis would be different. It would be the greater emphasis on the metaphysical aspects, when you're dealing with somebody like Venerable Mary of Agreda, who is clearly Scotistic in her approach. And then as well, the implications of that being that the emphasis on the absolute primacy of Christ would be higher than maybe what you would see with some of these other medieval Marian mystics. So anyways, guys, I'm up at an hour and 14 minutes, and I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Leave some comments. If nothing else, go pick up your tan books. If anybody ever wants to buy me the 4-volume set, I wouldn't cry about it. I would donate this to somebody who would get some benefit out of it. I'm just kidding, guys. Don't buy me the 4-volume set, but do go out and buy yourself a copy of at the very least, the abridged version, if not the entire version. Let's see. Oh, we got something else here. Could we say that there's an implicit Scotism a la Venerable Mary and the Blessed Mary Virgin's own Mariology at La Salette and Lourdes? La Salette I'm not as familiar with, but Lourdes, I'll tell you who was very interested in Lourdes was Maximilian Kolbe, and it's over on my bookshelf right now. I don't know how, let's see, Aurelius Augustinus, I don't know how interested in this you are, but the man who writes on this probably better than anybody else is Father Peter Fellner. His work, it's a dense work. It's hard to read and follow. It took me over a year, but it's truly changed my theological outlook. Was his work, The Theologian of Auschwitz, and it was taking the Immaculate Conception and how to move the Immaculate Conception into the life of believers in such a way that it's sanctifying. Sort of the Kolbian interests in the apparition of Lourdes is because when Our Lady comes to Bernadette, she doesn't say, I was immaculately conceived. She says, I am the Immaculate Conception. And Kolbe, being the Scotist that he was, being the Franciscan that he was within that long tradition, there's debates about how Scotistic Kolbe was. Read Father Fellner. I think he kind of dispels any myths that Kolbe, that like it's clear that Kolbe, like once you kind of tie all the pieces together, was Scotistic. And with Our Lady of Lourdes, I am the Immaculate Conception, there's great metaphysical implications towards that as to who Mary is in the economy of salvation, who she was in the divine councils. And he really presents I blew up Twitter one time. I'm trying to think. I blew up my Twitter. It's one of the, I've only had like 3 or 4 tweets go viral. Now, I'm sorry, guys. I've always called it Twitter. On X, one of my posts on X, where I discuss the implications of the Kolbian Mariology on who she is in relation to the Trinity. I get distracted very easy. I'm like the dog. The implications of the Immaculate Conception on the implications of Franciscan approach and theology on the Immaculate Conception, especially as it relates to Lourdes. Absolutely, Father Fellner is the guy to turn to, except that his work is very difficult and dense, and people have a hard time with it. Though I would say, probably even more than the Theologian of Auschwitz, get a copy of his collected essays. I think it's volume 6, the volume on St. Maximilian Kolbe and his writings on Maximilian Kolbe, and you will see undoubtedly the connections even to Venerable Mary, because Kolbe makes it about he calls it the golden thread, which is basically this thread from Francis all the way up to today, where there's this common theme, and the thread, the like fixed focal point of that thread is Our Lady. Your opinion on Mary Beth Ingham and Dr. Tim Ward's works on Blessed John Duns Scotus? I think you're thinking Tom Ward there, right? Is that Professor Tom Ward you're thinking of? Let me see. Yeah, I think you're thinking. I've had him on, actually. His work is a great introduction. His introduction is called, I've got it over there, it's called Order to Love. Scotus is a tough one to be introduced to. I came into the church via the route of St. Thomas, and St. Thomas, he kind of will make you feel more comfortable with your knowledge of medieval theology than you actually are. And I was reading St. Thomas and I'm like, wow, I get this. I actually get medieval theology. It's not that hard. And then you sit down with Scotus and you're like, wow, what did I just read? But so some of the commentaries on Scotus they're a mixed bag. The main thing I would say is don't go to Etienne Guisson's book on Scotus. Avoid, some people say avoid Cross, but I've heard, like, if you know what to read in Cross and it's Richard Cross. He's recently, I think, within the last several years, I don't think he's even Christian anymore, but he wrote a good introduction to Scotus. There's some errors in his thinking on it. Certainly Dr. Ward's book. I'm not for sure about Mary Beth. I would have to look into that, but certainly Professor Ward's work is a great introduction. And then who else? I'm trying to think. There's several that I have on my shelf over there, but brain's not functioning right now. I haven't been eating healthy enough. Haven't been eating brain food. The wife's been gone for days. Generally speaking, I say stick to the people themselves, but Scotus is a little bit trickier. If you are interested in his metaphysics, I would say, Cross is a good introduction. Professor Ward's, of course, a good introduction. Probably even better for just like a lay level introduction. And then if you're interested in the theological application of the absolute primacy of Christ, grab a primer on the absolute primacy of Christ. I forget what it's called, but it's the absolute primacy of Christ, a primer. And that's a great work as an introduction to Scotus. As well, I don't know if you watch the videos that I have on here, Eric. I don't know if you watch any of the videos that I have where I try to give a good introduction to Scotus, but it's challenging. It's challenging to present him in such a way where, and this is, I think, what Dr. Ward does a good job at, present Scotus, and I think he was very intentional when he did this, present Scotus in a way that's presentable, but you don't lose because the beauty to Scotus is his subtlety and his nuance. But because of his subtlety and his nuance, it's very easy to misconstrue what he's saying. Anyways, guys, I got to head out. God bless you all. I will see you next time.